Fuzzy Mud by Louis Sacker, Chapter 18, Wednesday, November 3rd, 1:00 p.m. It had been more than a month since Marshall had played basketball with his friends, a month since he'd had any friends, and all it had taken was a day, just one day without Chad. Marshall never did anything, Laura Musgrants had said. Chad's just mean. Those may have been the sweetest words he'd ever heard in his whole life. Still, as he sat at his desk in Mr. Davison's class, 3 seats away from Chad's empty desk, he couldn't get the image of Tamaya's grotesque hand out of his mind. Torn strips of bloody gauze had dangled from her blistered flesh. He saw her eyes too. They pleaded with him to do the right thing. Man, just when things are finally going good for me, he thought, why do girls always have to go and ruin everything? He knew the right thing to do. He had known it when Mrs. Thaxton had come into his classroom and told everyone that Chad was missing. The only reason he hadn't told her the truth right then and there was because he didn't want to get Tamaya in trouble. That was what he told himself. He had kept quiet for Tamaya's sake. But deep down, he knew that was not the truth. He had remained silent because he was scared and ashamed. Not that it mattered any more. He knew it was just a matter of time before Tamaya told someone, either her teacher, Miss Filbert, or Mrs. Thaxton. The classroom phone buzzed, and the sound seemed to vibrate deep down into his bones. As he watched Mr. Davison speak into the phone, he tried to read the expression on his teacher's face. His legs trembled beneath his desk. Mr. Davison hung up, and Marshall quickly cast his eyes downward, pretending to concentrate on his open book. Marshall, Mrs. Thaxton would like to see you in her office. He'd been expecting that, but the words still came as a jolt. His chair squeaked as he pushed back from his desk. He stood up and then walked out of the room, desperately trying to appear calm. He started up the stairs. Nothing made sense anymore. Chad beat him up, yet he was the one who was getting in trouble. Everyone was so worried about poor Chad. Where's Chad? Did you see him? Did you talk to him? What did he say? Chad's missing? Good. He's gone, and I'm glad he's gone. Did that make him a bad person? He reached the top of the stairs. The office was to the right, but Marshall's eyes were drawn the other way, down a short hallway, to a door with a window. Daylight shone through the window. He stared at the door for a long moment. Maybe it was time people started worrying about poor Marshall, he thought. He stared a moment longer, but then turned and headed toward the office. Tamaya was right. It was time to tell the truth. Mrs. Latherley had her back to him and was bent over as she placed a folder in a filing cabinet. Mrs. Thaxton asked to see me, he said. The school secretary straightened up. Oh, hi, Marshall. We're glad you're here. He wondered what she meant by that. She sent him on back to Mrs. Thaxton's office. The headmistress's door was open. He could see her sitting at her desk, staring out the window. He stepped inside and cleared his throat. You wanted to see me? She turned. Do you know where Tamaya is? It wasn't the question he'd expected, and for a moment he wondered if it was some kind of trick. Mrs. Thaxton's face quivered. Do you? She demanded. Miss Filbert's class? She's not there. She never returned after lunch. I know you two spend a lot of time together. Not a lot. We walk to school together. You know, because we live on the same street. Her mom won't let her walk to school alone. The words were coming out of his mouth as his mind was busily trying to come to grips with what was happening. Monica's her best friend, he said. Maybe she knows. I spoke to Monica. She says Tamaya suddenly left the lunchroom for no reason and never came back. Where were you at lunch? Outside, playing basketball. Did you see her? Let me think. I think I might have seen her by the court. Did she say anything to you? Now I remember. The ball bounced away and she got it. And I went and I got it from her. She didn't say anything about leaving school early? Well, this morning she told me her mom was picking her up after school to take her to see a doctor. She's got this really bad rash. Maybe her mom picked her up early. Mrs. Latherley left a message for her mother. We're waiting to hear back. Tamaya's pretty good about following rules, Marshall pointed out. She wouldn't just leave without telling someone. I know, said Mrs. Thaxton. That's exactly what worries me. Marshall waited, but for a long time Mrs. Thaxton didn't say anything. She was looking at him, but it felt more like she was looking through him, as if she had forgotten he was still there. You can go now, she said at last. He didn't have to be told twice. A short while later, Mrs. Thaxton announced over the PA system that the school was being put in lockdown. Students and teachers were to remain in their classes with the lights off and the doors locked. No one would be allowed to enter or leave the building. But by then, Marshall had already slipped out the side door. Like an escaping prisoner, he had dashed across the grass, frantically climbed over the fence, and then disappeared into the woods. Chapter 19, Wednesday, November 3rd, 1:10 p.m. Leaves continued to fall around Tamaya as she wandered through the trees, hoping to see something, anything that looked familiar from the day before. Then at last she'd know she was going in the right direction, but nothing stood out to her. Normally she was very observant. She was good at noticing small details, but yesterday she'd been so scared that she hadn't been able to focus on anything. All her concentration had been devoted to keeping close to Marshall. The only thing she remembered seeing was the fuzzy mud. If she could find that, then maybe Chad would be nearby. She tried to keep track of everything now. Tree stumps, twisted branches, rock formations. There was a tree with several planks of wood hammered to it. She made mental notes of everything she saw so that after she found Chad, she'd be able to find her way back. She stopped often. She'd turn around and then retrace her steps in her mind. "Chad!" she shouted. She didn't have a very loud or strong voice. Miss Filbert was constantly trying to get her to project. "You have a lot of good ideas, Tamaya. You need to speak with authority." Whenever it was her turn to read aloud in class, everyone always complained that they couldn't hear her. And out on the playground, sometimes she'd shout at Monica or Hope, and they wouldn't hear her, even though they were just on the other side of the dodgeball circle. She tried again, this time putting extra oomph behind it. "Chad!" The extra oomph just made her voice crack. She spotted a tree with white bark and just a few dead leaves left in its branches. One of the branches seemed to be pointing the way back to school. She fixed it in her memory. A little beyond the tree, she noticed a dark, muddy area. There was a layer of scummy fuzz floating just on top of it. She slowly made her way toward it. She didn't think it was the same mud puddle from the day before. She remembered now that that had been on the side of a hill. The ground around here was fairly level. She hooked her lunch sack onto a branch, then moved close to the mud. Just like before, there were no leaves on top of the mud, but they had fallen all around it. She knelt beside the edge of the puddle and could feel warmth radiating from the fuzzy mud. Her skin tingled, but that might just have been the heebie-jeebies playing with her mind. She picked up a leaf about the same size as her hand. Holding it by the stem, she slowly lowered it into the fuzz. When she lifted it back up, the top half was completely gone. She let it drop, then backed away as she stood up. She was getting her lunch sack when she saw another puddle of fuzzy mud just a little farther off. Beyond that, she could see what looked like two more. She turned to the white tree, its branch pointing the way back to school. It wasn't too late to go back. If she hurried, she might not get in trouble. She could go see Mrs. Latherley, take the allergy pill, and get her hand rebandaged. Then Mrs. Latherley could give her a note, excusing her for being late to class. The tree branch pointed one way. Tamaya went the other. "Chad!" she hollered. This time her voice didn't crack. She continued deeper into the woods. 2 times 65,536 equals 131,072. 2 times 131,072 equals 262,144. Chapter 20. 3 months later. In February of the following year, 3 months after Tamaya went back into the woods to search for Chad, the Senate Committee on Energy and the Environment held a new set of hearings. These hearings were not secret. By this time, the entire world knew about Sunray Farm, Bioline, and the disaster that occurred at Heathcliff, Pennsylvania. Dr. Peter Smythe, Deputy Director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, gave the following testimony at these Heathcliff disaster hearings. Senator Wright: were you able to identify the microorganism? Dr. Peter Smythe: no, not at that time. It didn't match anything in our database. Senator Wright: have you or anyone else at the CDC seen this type of rash before? Dr. Peter Smythe: again, no, nor did we know how to treat it. There was no cure. Senator Wright: and so you ordered the quarantine? Dr. Peter Smythe: the President ordered the quarantine based on my recommendation. No one was allowed to leave Heathcliff or the surrounding area. That included our own doctors and scientists. Once they entered the quarantine zone, they could not return. Thousands of people were infected. 5 people had already died. The one found in the woods, and then 4 more who were infected later. Senator Foote: all because of one little girl? Dr. Peter Smythe: 1 week after Tamaya Dilwadi went into the woods, more than 500 people showed signs of the rash, including many of her classmates. But it would be wrong to assume that it was caused by Tamaya. The invading organisms had simply overwhelmed the environment. By the time the first snow fell, this so-called fuzzy mud had spread to lawns and flower beds all over Heathcliff.